The turkey was perfect, the table set with our grandmother's china, and my sister Brooke was about to destroy everything. She leaned back in her chair with that smug expression I knew too well, her manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany dining table. "Alexia," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "let's be honest, you're not worthy of our family name." My mother Susan nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line of agreement. My father David couldn't even look at me, his gaze fixed firmly on his plate. The silence stretched between us like a chasm until Grandpa Frank set down his wine glass with deliberate precision, rose slowly from his chair, and declared in a voice that cut through the tension like a blade, "Then neither do you." Brooke's confident smile crumbled instantly. I should have seen this moment coming. For 28 years, I'd been living in the shadow of my perfect sister, watching her collect accolades like trophies while I struggled to find my place in our family. The Montgomery name carried weight in our small Connecticut town, built on 3 generations of success in the construction industry. When my great-grandfather started Montgomery & Sons back in 1942, he probably never imagined his legacy would become a weapon his own family wielded against each other. Brooke had always been everything our parents wanted in a daughter. Valedictorian at prep school, MBA from Yale, married to Brandon Hutchinson, one of the most successful attorneys in the county. She drove a BMW, lived in a colonial mansion with perfect landscaping, and belonged to the country club where she played tennis every Tuesday with the wives of local politicians and business owners. Meanwhile, I taught 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary, the underfunded public school on the other side of town. I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door from when I'd scraped against a garbage truck last winter. My apartment was a modest 2-bedroom rental above Mrs. Chen's Bakery on Main Street, where the smell of fresh bread wafted through my windows every morning at 5:30. The real fracture in our family had started 5 years ago when I announced I wouldn't be joining Montgomery & Sons after college. Dad had already printed business cards with my name, set aside an office, and planned my career trajectory from junior project manager to eventual partner. But I couldn't stomach the thought of spending my life surrounded by the same people who'd whispered about our family's wealth behind cupped hands at church socials and charity galas. Teaching gave me purpose that went beyond profit margins and client satisfaction. When little Maria Rodriguez finally learned to read after months of struggle, when Tommy Washington's face lit up during a science experiment, when Sarah Kim overcame her shyness to present her project about butterflies to the entire class, I felt more fulfilled than any construction contract could ever make me. But my parents saw it as betrayal. Every family dinner became an opportunity to remind me of what I'd thrown away, what I owed to the family legacy, how selfish I was to pursue my own dreams instead of honoring their sacrifices. Brooke never missed a chance to twist the knife deeper, comparing her quarterly bonuses to my teacher's salary, her designer wardrobe to my Target clearance finds, her elaborate vacations to my weekend camping trips. Tonight had started like any other holiday gathering. Brooke arrived fashionably late in her husband's Tesla, carrying expensive wine and wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She'd spent the appetizer course detailing her latest business triumph, how she'd negotiated a multi-million-dollar deal for a luxury resort development that would bring prestige and profit to Montgomery & Sons. Then the conversation had turned to me, as it always did, with that particular blend of curiosity and judgment that made my stomach clench. Mom had asked about my job with the tone she might use to inquire about a chronic illness. I'd mentioned the reading program I'd started for struggling students, how we'd secured a small grant to buy new books for the library. That's when Brooke had delivered her verdict. Not worthy of our family name. The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, acrid and suffocating. I'd felt the familiar burn of tears behind my eyes, the crushing weight of never being enough, never measuring up, never earning the love that seemed to flow so freely toward my sister. But then Grandpa Frank had spoken. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd built an empire with his bare hands, who'd survived the Depression and World War II, who understood the difference between worth and wealth. The man who'd taught me to fish at Pearson Lake, who'd listened to my dreams without judgment, who'd quietly slipped me $20 bills throughout my childhood with a wink and instructions to buy something that makes you happy. Now he stood beside me, his weathered hand reaching into his jacket pocket. When he pulled out his smartphone, his fingers moved with surprising dexterity for a 78-year-old man. The screen illuminated his lined face as he scrolled through photos, and when he found what he was looking for, his expression hardened into something I'd never seen before. "Brooke," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of granite. "Perhaps you'd like to explain this to your husband when he arrives." He turned the phone screen toward the table, and I watched my sister's face transform from smugness to confusion to absolute terror. The photo showed her emerging from the Riverside Motor Inn, one of those seedy establishments on Route 9 that rented rooms by the hour. She wasn't alone. A man with his arm around her waist was clearly visible, and it definitely wasn't Brandon. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of family judgment. This was the breathless hush that precedes an avalanche, when everyone realizes the mountain is about to come down and there's nowhere left to run. Brooke's hands flew to her throat as if the air had suddenly become too thick to breathe. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the way all color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll that someone had forgotten to paint properly. "That's not what it looks like," she stammered, but her voice cracked like thin ice under pressure. "I can explain. This is completely taken out of context." Grandpa Frank lowered the phone but didn't put it away. His steel-gray eyes remained fixed on Brooke with the intensity of a judge delivering a verdict. "Context," he repeated slowly, as if testing the word for truth. "Would that context include the 8 other photos I have of you and Jake Sullivan at various locations over the past 6 months?" Mom's wine glass slipped from her fingers, hitting the table with a sharp clink that made everyone jump. Red wine spread across the white tablecloth like a bloodstain, but nobody moved to clean it up. Dad's fork remained suspended halfway to his mouth, a piece of turkey growing cold in the November air. Jake Sullivan. I knew that name. He owned Sullivan Construction, one of our biggest subcontractors. A married man with 3 kids who lived in the same neighborhood as Brooke and Brandon. I'd met him at last year's company barbecue, where he'd seemed charming enough, though I'd noticed how his eyes lingered on the younger women present. "Grandpa," I whispered, finding my voice despite the shock that had rendered me speechless. "How did you get these pictures?" His weathered face softened when he looked at me, the harsh lines around his eyes easing into something resembling sadness. "I hired a private investigator 3 months ago. Started noticing some irregularities in the business accounts, meetings that didn't quite add up, explanations that seemed a little too convenient." Brooke shot to her feet so quickly her chair toppled backward, clattering against the hardwood floor. "You had me followed? You violated my privacy because of some paranoid suspicions?" "Sit down, Brooke." Dad's voice cut through her protest like a blade, sharp and commanding in a way I'd rarely heard. "Frank, what kind of irregularities?" Grandpa Frank reached into his jacket again, this time producing a manila folder thick with documents. His movements were deliberate, methodical, like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Purchase orders that don't match invoices, payments to vendors we've never used, business trips that our travel agent never booked. He spread the papers across the table, pushing aside plates and glasses to make room. Bank statements, receipts, hotel records, each document a piece of a puzzle that painted an increasingly damning picture. My heart hammered against my ribs as I recognized what I was seeing. "This boat," Grandpa said, pointing to a receipt dated 2 months ago. $35,000, charged to the company as equipment rental. Funny thing is, I called the marina where it's docked. Turns out it's registered under Jake Sullivan's name as a gift from an anonymous admirer. Brooke collapsed back into her chair, the fight draining out of her like air from a punctured balloon. "It's not what you think," she whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Then, explain it," Mom said, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman who'd always been Brooke's fiercest defender, who'd made excuses for every questionable decision and justified every selfish act, now stared at her eldest daughter with something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. The story that emerged over the next 20 minutes was worse than any of us had imagined. It had started innocently enough, Brooke claimed. Jake had been working on a project that required frequent communication, late-night planning sessions, collaboration on budget proposals. Brandon had been traveling constantly for his law firm, leaving Brooke alone with their social commitments and growing boredom. What began as professional conversations had evolved into personal confessions, shared frustrations about marriage, dreams of adventure and passion that felt increasingly distant from their suburban reality. Jake made her feel alive, in ways she'd forgotten were possible, appreciated her intelligence and ambition instead of taking them for granted. The first time they'd met outside of business had been for coffee, just to discuss a project away from the office chaos. Coffee became lunch. Lunch became dinner. Dinner became long drives in his pickup truck, where they talked about everything except their spouses and responsibilities. The first kiss happened in the parking lot of Rosario's restaurant after too much wine and too many confessions about unhappiness. The first night together was at the Riverside Motor Inn, chosen specifically because nobody they knew would ever have reason to be there. "I never meant for it to go this far," Brooke said, her voice breaking with what might have been genuine remorse. "I thought I could control it, keep it separate from everything else. It was just supposed to be something that made me feel good about myself again." But feelings had evolved into financial entanglement when Jake's own construction business hit rough waters last spring. A major contract had fallen through, leaving him unable to pay his workers or cover equipment loans. Brooke had convinced herself that helping him was helping the family business by keeping a valuable partner afloat. The boat was just the latest in a series of increasingly expensive gestures. There had been the down payment on office space for Jake's company expansion, the luxury tools that would supposedly increase his efficiency on Montgomery projects, the weekend trips to Boston and New York that were justified as business development opportunities. Each expenditure had been carefully disguised, spread across different budget categories, mixed in with legitimate business expenses in ways that would escape casual scrutiny. But Grandpa Frank wasn't a casual observer. He'd built Montgomery & Sons from nothing, survived economic downturns and industry changes that had crushed larger competitors. He knew every dollar that came in and went out, understood the rhythm of cash flow like a musician understands tempo. "How much?" Dad asked finally, his voice hollow with the kind of exhaustion that comes from having your world reshuffled without warning. "How much money are we talking about?" Grandpa Frank flipped to the last page in his folder, where neat columns of numbers added up to a figure that made my stomach drop like a stone. $87,000 over 6 months. Not enough to bankrupt us, but enough to cause real problems if it continued. The number hung in the air like a physical presence, heavy and accusing. $87,000. Almost 3 times my annual teaching salary. Money that could have funded new equipment for the company, bonuses for hardworking employees, or college scholarships for deserving students. Instead, it had bought my sister a fantasy, a middle-aged businessman's affection, and a collection of lies that were now crumbling around her like a house built on sand. But as devastating as the financial betrayal was, I could see something else in Grandpa Frank's eyes, something that suggested we'd only reached the shallow end of this particular revelation. His fingers drummed against the table in a rhythm I recognized from childhood, the same pattern he'd tap when working through a particularly complex construction problem. "There's more, isn't there?" I asked quietly. He nodded slowly, his gaze moving from Brooke to my parents, and finally settling on me. "The money was just the beginning, sweetheart. The real question is what else she was willing to sacrifice for this relationship." That's when he pulled out the bank statements that would change everything we thought we knew about our family, our business, and just how far Brooke had been willing to go to protect her secret life. Grandpa Frank had been 15 years old when the stock market crashed in 1929, old enough to understand that the comfortable middle-class life his family had built could disappear overnight like smoke in a strong wind. His father's hardware store had failed within 6 months, forcing them to move from their house on Elm Street to a cramped apartment above Murphy's Tavern where the smell of stale beer and cigarettes seeped through the floorboards. He'd learned about resilience from watching his mother take in washing and ironing to keep food on the table while his father drank away his shame and regret. He'd learned about opportunity from recognizing that people would always need houses built and roads paved, even during the worst economic times. Most importantly, he'd learned about character from observing which neighbors helped each other survive and which ones turned their backs when times got tough. By 18, he was working construction crews during the day and taking business classes at night, saving every penny he could squeeze from his small salary. Pearl Harbor interrupted those plans, sending him to the Pacific Theater, where he spent 3 years building airstrips and bunkers while dodging Japanese bombs and learning that survival often depended on the integrity of the person fighting beside you. When he returned home in 1946, he used his military savings and a veteran's loan to buy his first piece of construction equipment, a beat-up bulldozer that broke down more often than it worked, but gave him the independence he'd been dreaming about since childhood. Montgomery & Sons had started as a one-man operation, taking on the jobs nobody else wanted. Clearing debris from storm damage, digging septic systems for new subdivisions, any back-breaking work that paid enough to cover equipment payments and put food on his table. Success had come gradually, built on a reputation for showing up when promised, finishing jobs on schedule, and charging fair prices that reflected quality work rather than maximum profit. He'd married my grandmother Helen in 1949, and they'd had my father David in 1952, followed by Uncle Robert 2 years later. The company had grown alongside the family, expanding from earth-moving to general construction as post-war prosperity brought suburban development to our corner of Connecticut. By the time I was born, Montgomery & Sons employed 43 people and had built half the shopping centers and office complexes within a 20-mile radius. But growth hadn't changed Grandpa Frank's fundamental philosophy about business or family. Success meant nothing if it came at the expense of the values that made success worthwhile in the first place. Integrity wasn't negotiable. Loyalty was earned through actions, not demanded through blood relations. Hard work was its own reward, regardless of whether anyone else appreciated the effort. Those beliefs had shaped how he'd raised my father, though with mixed results. Dad understood the business side of the equation, but sometimes struggled with the human element, particularly when it came to his own children. He loved us, I had no doubt about that, but he'd somehow absorbed the idea that love needed to be demonstrated through achievement rather than expressed through acceptance. Grandpa Frank had watched this dynamic play out over the years with growing concern. He'd seen how his son's expectations had pushed Brooke toward a performance-based approach to relationships where worth was measured by external validation. He'd also seen how those same expectations had driven me away from the family business, not because I lacked ability or interest, but because I needed space to discover my own identity beyond their predetermined plans. The investigation he'd launched hadn't been motivated by suspicion of Brooke specifically. It had started with his normal practice of reviewing quarterly financials, the same habit that had helped him catch embezzlement attempts by employees over the years and identify cost overruns before they became serious problems. This time, though, the irregularities had a different pattern. Instead of random theft or careless spending, there seemed to be intentional misdirection, sophisticated accounting manipulation that suggested someone with intimate knowledge of their systems. The amounts were significant but not immediately catastrophic, spread out over enough time and categories to avoid triggering automatic oversight protocols. His first instinct had been to discuss the discrepancies with Dad, but something had held him back. Maybe it was the timing, coinciding with Brooke's increased involvement in major project decisions. Maybe it was the subtle changes he'd noticed in family dynamics, the way conversations shifted when certain topics arose, the tension that seemed to hover around business discussions. Instead, he'd hired Patricia Morrison, a private investigator recommended by their corporate attorney. Her initial report had confirmed his worst fears while revealing problems he'd never imagined possible. Now, sitting at our Thanksgiving table with the evidence spread before us like pieces of a shattered mirror, he faced the most difficult decision of his 78 years. Everything he'd built, everything he'd hoped to pass down to future generations, hung in the balance between justice and family loyalty. "I need to tell you something else," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "Something I probably should have shared with your parents years ago." Dad looked up from the bank statements he'd been studying, his face pale with shock and growing anger. "What now, Frank? How much worse can this possibly get?" Grandpa Frank reached into his jacket one more time, producing a legal document bound in blue paper that looked official and intimidating. "This is my will. Updated 6 months ago after I first noticed the financial irregularities. David, you and Susan have always assumed that you own 60% of Montgomery & Sons, with Brooke and Alexia set to inherit equal shares when I pass away. Mom's hand flew to her throat in the same gesture Brooke had made earlier, though for different reasons. Assumed? Frank, we've been operating under that understanding for 15 years, ever since you stepped back from day-to-day operations. I know, he said gently, and I allowed you to believe that because it seemed like the right arrangement at the time. But I've always maintained controlling interest in the company. I own 63% of Montgomery & Sons, not the 40% you thought was my share. The silence that followed was thick with implications none of us had time to fully process. Brooke's embezzlement was suddenly more than a family crisis. It was theft from the majority shareholder, a criminal matter rather than an internal dispute. But Grandpa Frank wasn't finished. According to this new will, I'm leaving my entire share of the company to one person. The grandchild who understands what our family name really means, what it's supposed to represent in this community. His eyes found mine across the table, and I felt my heart stop beating for what seemed like an eternity. Alexia, you've spent your adult life serving others, putting the needs of children ahead of your own comfort, choosing purpose over profit every single day. You understand that the Montgomery name should stand for integrity, hard work, and making your community stronger, not just making yourself richer. Brooke's face had gone beyond pale into something approaching gray, like old concrete that had weathered too many storms. Grandpa, you can't be serious. I made a mistake, yes, but I've devoted my career to this company. I have the education, the experience, the connections to take Montgomery & Sons to the next level. Education didn't stop you from stealing from your own family, he replied, his voice as steady as the foundation of the houses he'd built. Experience didn't prevent you from betraying your marriage and your business partnerships. Connections didn't teach you the difference between right and wrong. He turned back to me, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I saw something that might have been hope in his weathered features. I don't expect you to make any decisions tonight, sweetheart. This is a lot to process. And you have your own life, your own career that brings you satisfaction. But I want you to know that the option exists if you ever decide you're ready for a different kind of challenge. The weight of what he was offering settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Montgomery & Sons wasn't just a business. It was a legacy, a responsibility to 43 families who depended on steady work, to clients who trusted our reputation, to a community that had supported our success for 3 generations. But it was also a chance to prove that the values I'd learned from him, the lessons about service and integrity and putting purpose before profit, could work in the business world just as effectively as they worked in a 3rd-grade classroom. As I sat there trying to absorb the magnitude of what had just changed in my life, I heard the sound of car tires on gravel in the driveway. Through the dining room window, I could see headlights cutting through the November darkness, moving at a speed that suggested urgency rather than casual arrival. Grandpa Frank's expression shifted to something resembling grim satisfaction as he checked his watch. Right on time, he murmured. I called Brandon before dinner and suggested he might want to join us for dessert. Told him we had some family business to discuss that might interest him. The color that had begun returning to Brooke's face drained away once again as she realized her husband was about to walk into the middle of this disaster. But as we all soon discovered, Brandon's arrival would bring revelations that made everything we'd already learned seem like a gentle introduction to the real scope of Brooke's deception. The front door opened before anyone could reach it, which meant Brandon still had his key despite the growing distance between him and Brooke over the past year. His footsteps echoed through the marble foyer, quick and purposeful, carrying the weight of a man who'd received a phone call that confirmed his worst suspicions. When he appeared in the dining room doorway, I barely recognized the confident attorney I'd known for the past 7 years. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his tie loosened and askew, his expensive suit wrinkled as if he'd been sleeping in his office chair. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd been losing sleep long before tonight's revelations. "Brandon," Brooke whispered, half rising from her chair before collapsing back down as if her legs had forgotten how to support her weight. "I can explain everything. This isn't what it looks like." He didn't respond immediately, instead scanning the scene before him with the trained eye of someone accustomed to reading courtrooms and assessing hostile witnesses. The scattered documents on the table, Grandpa Frank's grim expression, my parents' shell-shocked faces, and finally, Brooke's tear-streaked makeup told a story that required no legal interpretation. "How long have you known?" Brooke asked, when the silence became unbearable, her voice barely audible above the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. Brandon pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be a lengthy series of text messages and emails. "I hired my own investigator 8 weeks ago when our credit card statements started showing charges at restaurants I'd never been to. Hotels in cities where I knew you had no business meetings." The calm control in his voice was more devastating than shouting would have been. This wasn't the angry outburst of a man discovering betrayal. This was the methodical presentation of someone who'd been preparing for this conversation for months. "But I suspected long before that," he continued, his professional demeanor never wavering. "Little things that didn't quite add up. Phone calls you'd take in another room. Shopping trips that lasted 6 hours but produced no purchases. Business dinners that required you to dress like you were going to a nightclub." Brooke's hands were shaking now, reaching across the table toward her husband in a gesture that fell short by several inches. "Brandon, please. I made mistakes, but it's not too late. We can work through this. Marriage counseling, therapy, whatever you think we need." That's when his professional composure finally cracked, revealing the raw pain underneath. "Work through this? Brooke, you stole money from your own family to buy gifts for another man. You lied to my face every single day for 6 months. You made me look like a fool in front of our friends, our colleagues, our neighbors." He pulled out a manila folder that looked suspiciously similar to the one Grandpa Frank had produced earlier, though this one appeared even thicker. "But the affair isn't why I called the police tonight. It's not even why I filed for divorce this morning." The words hit the room like a physical force, causing Mom to gasp and Dad to drop the papers he'd been holding. But it was Brooke's reaction that truly captured the magnitude of what Brandon had just revealed. She doubled over as if someone had punched her in the stomach, making a sound that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a scream. "You didn't," she whispered when she could finally speak. "Brandon, you couldn't have. Not without talking to me first." "I did talk to you," he replied, his voice growing harder with each word. "6 weeks ago, when I first confronted you about the affair, I gave you a chance to come clean about everything. You looked me in the eye and swore on our marriage that Jake Sullivan meant nothing to you, that it was already over, that you were committed to making things right between us." He opened his folder and pulled out photographs that made everyone at the table lean forward despite themselves. Unlike Grandpa Frank's surveillance pictures, these were clear, high-resolution images that left no room for interpretation or excuse. "These were taken 3 days after that conversation," Brandon said, sliding the photos across the table. "At the Marriott in Hartford, where you spent the afternoon while I was in court believing we were going to save our marriage." But the photos weren't what had prompted Brandon to call the police. As he continued pulling documents from his folder, a much larger pattern of deception began to emerge, one that extended far beyond my sister's personal life into areas that could destroy multiple families and businesses. "Brooke has been stealing from my law firm's client trust fund," Brandon announced, his words falling into the room like stones into still water. "Over the past 4 months, she's transferred $63,000 from accounts belonging to 3 different clients into a personal checking account she opened under a false name." The magnitude of what he was describing hit me like a physical blow. Client trust funds were sacred in the legal profession, money held in escrow for real estate transactions, estate settlements, and other legal matters where attorneys acted as neutral custodians. Stealing from trust funds wasn't just embezzlement, it was a felony that could send someone to prison for years and destroy the career of any lawyer associated with the crime. "How?" Dad asked, his voice hoarse with shock. "How could she access client money from your firm?" Brandon's expression shifted to something that might have been embarrassment mixed with self-recrimination. "I gave her access to our accounting system 2 years ago when my assistant was out on maternity leave. Brooke helped with administrative tasks, filing, client communications. She was smart, efficient, trustworthy, or so I thought." The The technology of theft turned out to be surprisingly simple. Brooke had used her administrative access to identify clients with large trust fund balances, particularly those involved in complex estate settlements where funds might sit untouched for months. She'd created false invoices for legal services, processed payments to the fake account, then moved the money through a series of transfers designed to obscure the trail. The first theft was only $500, Brandon explained, his professional detachment beginning to crack again, from an estate account that contained over $200,000. Small enough that it wouldn't be noticed immediately, large enough to test whether the system would catch the irregularity. When nothing happened, when no alarms went off and no questions were asked, Brooke had grown bolder. The amounts increased gradually, spread across different accounts, timed to coincide with busy periods when attention might be focused elsewhere. She convinced herself that it was temporary, Brandon continued, though his tone suggested he found such justification pathetic rather than sympathetic. Borrowed money that she'd pay back once Jake's business recovered, once the Montgomery contract started generating bigger profits, once she figured out how to make everything right again. But financial desperation had driven increasingly reckless behavior. The $63,000 had funded not just gifts for Jake Sullivan, but a lifestyle that allowed Brooke to maintain her image as the successful Montgomery daughter, while her actual marriage and career crumbled around her. There had been expensive dinners at restaurants neither she nor Brandon could afford on their normal budget. Weekend trips to New York and Boston that she'd justified as business development while actually using them for romantic getaways. Designer clothes and jewelry that made her feel worthy of Jake's attention while draining resources that belonged to other people. The irony, Brandon said, his voice thick with bitter laughter, is that she probably could have asked me for money. We could have discussed financial problems, worked out payment plans, found legal ways to help Jake's business if that's what she really wanted. But she was so committed to maintaining her perfect image that she chose theft over honesty. As devastating as these revelations were, I could see that Brandon still wasn't finished. His folder contained more documents, and his expression suggested that everything we'd heard so far was merely prologue to something even worse. "The police are on their way," he announced quietly. "Detective Martinez from the Financial Crimes Unit. He's been building a case for 2 weeks, ever since I reported the theft and provided evidence of how it was accomplished." Brooke shot to her feet again, but this time she didn't collapse back down. Instead, she began pacing around the dining room like a caged animal, her hands pulling at her hair and her voice rising to a pitch that made everyone wince. "You can't do this to me!" she screamed at Brandon, then whirled to face our parents. "Mom, Dad, you can't let them arrest your own daughter over money that I was going to pay back anyway. This is family business. We handle family problems inside the family." But even as she spoke, we could all hear the sound of sirens approaching from the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The cavalry Brandon had called was arriving to enforce consequences that no amount of family loyalty could prevent or delay. That's when Brooke's desperation reached its full, ugly flowering. Unable to accept responsibility for choices that had brought her to this moment, she turned her fury toward the one person in the room who'd never hurt her, never judged her, never done anything except try to find her own path in life. "This is all Alexia's fault," she shrieked, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "She's been jealous of me her entire life, resentful that I was successful while she wasted her education on some poverty-level job with ungrateful kids. She's been plotting against me, turning Grandpa Frank against me, manipulating everyone to steal my inheritance." The accusations kept flowing like water from a burst dam, each one more outrageous than the last. I had supposedly seduced Jake Sullivan to frame Brooke for adultery. I had somehow hacked into Brandon's law firm computers to make it appear that Brooke was stealing. I had forged documents, bribed witnesses, and orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy to destroy her reputation and claim the family business for myself. "She's not even a real Montgomery," Brooke screamed as the sirens grew loud enough to drown out the grandfather clock. "Look at her, living in that pathetic apartment, driving that piece of junk car, pretending to care about other people's children because she's too pathetic to have any of her own. She doesn't deserve our name, our legacy, or any consideration from this family." The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking, But what struck me most was how completely she'd lost touch with reality. In her desperation to avoid consequences for her own choices, she'd created an elaborate fantasy where I was the villain and she was the innocent victim of circumstances beyond her control. But her ranting was interrupted by red and blue lights flashing through the dining room windows, followed by the sound of car doors slamming and official voices coordinating outside our front door. The moment of reckoning had arrived, carrying with it consequences that would reshape our family in ways none of us could yet imagine. Detective Elena Martinez stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent 15 years investigating white-collar crimes in Connecticut's wealthiest communities. She wore a navy blue blazer over dark slacks, her silver badge clipped to her belt alongside handcuffs that caught the dining room chandelier light as she moved. Following behind her were Officer James Park, a uniformed policeman who looked young enough to be one of my students, and Detective Marcus Thompson, whose presence suggested this case involved more jurisdictions than just our local police department. The formality of their entrance transformed our family dining room into something resembling a courtroom where judgment was about to be rendered. "Mrs. Brooke Hutchinson," Detective Martinez said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. "I'm Detective Martinez, with the Connecticut State Police Financial Crimes Unit. You're under arrest for embezzlement from the law firm of Hutchinson, Bradley and Associates, conspiracy to commit fraud, and theft of funds exceeding $50,000. The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed, each charge landing like a physical blow. Brooke's face went through a series of transformations, from disbelief to terror to a desperate kind of calculation as she searched for some angle that might still save her. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, her voice taking on the same tone she'd used as a child when caught breaking rules. "I can explain everything. I have documentation showing that these were legitimate business transactions." Detective Martinez pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be an extensive digital file. "Mrs. Hutchinson, we have security footage from 3 different banks showing you depositing checks made out to Phoenix Consulting Services, a company that doesn't exist at any registered business address in Connecticut. We have computer records showing that you accessed client trust fund accounts 47 times over the past 4 months, always outside of normal business hours when other staff members weren't present." Each piece of evidence she recited was another nail in the coffin of Brooke's denials. There were email trails showing communication with vendors who'd never provided services to the law firm, hotel receipts charged to the fake consulting company for romantic weekends that coincided with Brandon's business trips, credit card statements showing purchases at expensive restaurants and boutiques that had been funded by money stolen from legal clients who trusted the Hutchinson firm to protect their assets. "We also have cooperation from Jake Sullivan," Detective Thompson added, his deep voice carrying a hint of satisfaction. "He's been working with our investigators for the past week, providing details about gifts and payments you made using embezzled funds." This revelation hit Brooke like a slap across the face. Her lover, the man for whom she'd destroyed her marriage and career, had apparently decided that saving himself was more important than protecting the woman who'd sacrificed everything for their relationship. "Jake wouldn't," she whispered. But even as she spoke, the certainty in her voice began to crumble. "He loves me. He wouldn't betray me like that." "Mr. Sullivan is married with 3 children," Detective Martinez replied matter-of-factly. "When faced with the choice between protecting you and protecting his own family from the consequences of your crimes, he chose his family. He's provided detailed statements about money you gave him, trips you funded, and conversations where you admitted to taking funds from both your family's business and your husband's law firm." The systematic destruction of Brooke's defense mechanisms was painful to watch, even given everything she'd done. "This was my sister, the person who'd taught me to ride a bicycle and helped me with algebra homework, who'd held my hand during thunderstorms when we were children, and shared whispered secrets about boys we liked in middle school. But it was also someone who'd made choices that hurt innocent people, who'd stolen money from clients depending on legal protection, who'd betrayed every relationship that mattered in pursuit of a fantasy that was always destined to collapse." "You have the right to remain silent," Officer Park began, stepping forward with handcuffs that seemed impossibly large and official in our family dining room. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As he continued reading Brooke her rights, I watched our parents struggling to process what was happening to their eldest daughter. Mom kept making small, choked sounds, as if she couldn't quite get enough air into her lungs. Dad sat frozen in his chair, staring at the legal documents spread across the table without seeming to see them. But the most surprising reaction came from Grandpa Frank, who rose slowly from his chair and walked around the table to where Brooke stood between the two officers. For a moment, I thought he might try to intervene, to use his influence in the community to somehow delay or prevent what was happening. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, holding it out toward Brooke with an expression that mixed sadness with determination. "This is the number for Sarah Chen, one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the state. She's expensive, but she's honest, and she's competent. You're going to need both of those qualities in the coming months." The gesture was so unexpected, so characteristic of the man who'd taught me that you could condemn someone's actions while still caring about their welfare, that I felt tears burning behind my eyes for the first time since this nightmare had begun. Brooke stared at the card as if she couldn't quite comprehend what it represented. "Grandpa," she whispered, "I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I just got in over my head and didn't know how to get out." "I know, sweetheart," he replied gently. "But sorry doesn't undo the damage, and good intentions don't excuse bad choices. You're going to have to face the consequences of what you've done, and hopefully learn something from the experience that makes you a better person on the other side." As Officer Park guided Brooke toward the front door, she turned back toward our family one more time. Her makeup was completely ruined now, mascara streaking down her cheeks in dark lines that made her look like a broken doll. But in that moment, I saw something in her expression that might have been the beginning of genuine remorse, rather than the self-serving desperation that had characterized her earlier protests. "I love you all," she said quietly. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope someday you might be able to remember me as more than just the person who caused all this pain." The front door closed behind her with a finality that seemed to echo through the entire house. Through the dining room windows, we watched as she was helped into the back of Detective Martinez's unmarked sedan, her head ducked down in shame as neighbors began emerging from their houses to see what all the commotion was about. Within minutes, our Thanksgiving disaster would be the subject of whispered conversations and social media posts throughout our small community. The Montgomery family scandal would be front-page news in tomorrow's local paper, complete with photos of Brooke being led away in handcuffs and speculation about what this meant for the future of our family business. But as devastating as the public humiliation would be, I realized that the real consequences of this evening were just beginning to unfold. Montgomery and Sons employed 43 people whose livelihoods depended on our reputation and financial stability. Clients who'd trusted us with major construction projects would begin questioning whether they wanted to do business with a family that couldn't maintain basic integrity within its own ranks. The empire that Grandpa Frank had spent 70 years building was now in danger of collapsing, not because of economic forces or industry changes, but because of choices made by someone who'd never understood the difference between deserving success and earning it. As Detective Martinez and Officer Park drove away with Brooke in custody, I found myself facing a question I'd never imagined having to answer. Was I prepared to abandon the teaching career I loved to save a family business I'd never wanted, in order to protect the legacy of a grandfather who'd always believed in my potential even when I didn't believe in it myself? The answer would determine not just my future, but the futures of everyone who depended on Montgomery and Sons to provide the stability and opportunity that had made our family's success possible in the first place. 6 months later, I stood in the Montgomery and Sons conference room, looking out at faces I was still learning to recognize. Sarah Williams, our head foreman, had calloused hands and 23 years of experience building everything from shopping centers to luxury homes. Miguel Rodriguez managed our equipment maintenance and could diagnose mechanical problems that stumped engineers half his age. Janet Foster handled payroll and benefits with the precision of someone who understood that every number represented a family depending on steady income. These weren't just employees, they were the backbone of a business that had provided reliable employment in our community for 3 generations. and they were all looking at me with a mixture of hope and skepticism as I prepared to deliver news that could determine whether Montgomery and Sons survived the scandal that had nearly destroyed us. The morning after Brooke's arrest, I'd called in sick to Lincoln Elementary for the first time in 4 years. Instead of teaching third graders about fractions and butterfly life cycles, I'd spent the day in emergency meetings with our accountants, lawyers, and insurance representatives, trying to assess the damage and develop a plan for moving forward. The financial losses were significant but manageable. Brooke's embezzlement had cost us $87,000, while her theft from Brandon's law firm had created potential liability issues that required expensive legal consultation. More importantly, the publicity had already begun affecting our business relationships. 3 major clients had called before noon to postpone projects pending further review of our company's stability. 2 subcontractors had requested immediate payment of outstanding invoices, apparently concerned that we might not be able to meet our obligations. The phone had rung constantly with reporters, competitors eager for inside information, and community members offering everything from sympathy to unsolicited advice about family management. But the real test had come that afternoon when I'd gathered our employees in this same conference room to explain what had happened and what it meant for their jobs. Some had already heard news reports or social media speculation. Others were learning about Brooke's crimes for the first time, their faces showing the same shock and disbelief that had characterized our family's reaction. "I won't lie to you," I'd told them that day. "This is the worst crisis Montgomery and Sons has ever faced. We've lost money, damaged relationships, and attracted negative attention that could take years to overcome. But we're not giving up, and we're not laying anyone off unless there's absolutely no alternative." The promise had been easier to make than to keep. Over the following months, I'd worked harder than I'd ever worked in my life, learning aspects of the construction business I'd never needed to understand as long as I was planning to teach elementary school forever. Grandpa Frank had become my mentor in ways that went far beyond our previous grandfather-granddaughter relationship. Every morning at 6:30, we'd meet at the office where he'd walk me through project budgets, client relationships, subcontractor negotiations, and the 1,000 small details that kept a construction business running smoothly. I'd learned about bid preparation and permit applications, about the difference between load-bearing walls and decorative structures, about scheduling that balanced efficiency with weather delays and material availability. More importantly, I'd learned about the people side of construction management, how to motivate crews working in difficult conditions and maintain relationships with clients whose trust had been shaken by our family's problems. The learning curve had been steep and sometimes discouraging. There were days when I'd driven home exhausted and overwhelmed, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake by leaving teaching for an industry where I felt like a perpetual beginner. But there were also moments of genuine satisfaction, when a project came together smoothly, when a client expressed appreciation for work completed on schedule and under budget, when I could see the tangible results of our team's efforts taking shape in the form of buildings that would serve the community for decades. My parents had struggled to adjust to the new family dynamics. Dad had initially resented my rapid promotion to positions he'd expected Brooke to fill, viewing my leadership as a reminder of his older daughter's failures rather than recognition of my potential. Mom had oscillated between grief over Brooke's imprisonment and resentment toward me for benefiting from my sister's downfall, but necessity had forced adaptation. With Brooke serving a 3-year sentence at the Women's Correctional Facility in Niantic and Brandon refusing all contact with our family following their divorce, I was the only option for continuing the Montgomery legacy. My parents had gradually accepted that their assumptions about their daughters' futures had been completely wrong, and that the child they'd considered less successful might actually be better suited for the responsibilities they'd always assigned to Brooke. The transformation hadn't been smooth or quick. There had been difficult conversations about leadership styles, strategic priorities, and the fundamental values that should guide our business practices. But slowly, painfully, we'd begun building a new kind of family relationship based on mutual respect rather than predetermined roles. The turning point had come in February when the Riverside Regional School District had announced plans for a major renovation project involving 3 elementary schools and a new administration building. The contract was worth $2.4 million over 18 months, Exactly the kind of high-profile project that could restore our reputation and financial stability. Initially, our bid hadn't even been considered. The school board was understandably reluctant to award a major contract to a company whose family scandals had made headlines just months earlier. But I'd requested a meeting with Superintendent Patricia Chen, arguing that Montgomery & Sons deserved to be judged on our work history rather than our personal problems. Dr. Chen, I'd said during that crucial conversation, I understand your concerns about our family situation, but our crews built the current Riverside Elementary building 15 years ago, and it's still considered one of the best constructed schools in the district. Miguel Rodriguez, who supervised that project, is still with our company and would oversee this renovation work. More importantly, I'd proposed an innovation that addressed both the district's needs and my own passion for education. Instead of simply completing the construction work and moving on to the next project, Montgomery & Sons would create a mentorship program connecting our skilled tradespeople with high school students interested in construction careers. We're not just building schools, I'd explained. We're building the next generation of craftspeople who will maintain and improve these facilities for decades to come. Students will learn real skills while our experienced workers share knowledge that can't be taught in traditional classrooms. The idea had resonated with Dr. Chen's vision for connecting education with practical career preparation. After extensive discussion and careful review of our safety protocols and educational qualifications, the school board had awarded us the contract with the understanding that our mentorship program would become a model for other districts considering similar initiatives. Now, 6 months after that breakthrough, I was ready to announce results that exceeded everyone's expectations. The school renovation project was ahead of schedule and under budget. 12 high school students had completed our summer apprenticeship program, with 3 receiving full-time job offers from Montgomery & Sons, and 4 others securing positions with other construction companies in the area. More significantly, word of our innovative approach had spread throughout the region. 2 other school districts had requested proposals for similar projects, while a non-profit organization focused on career development had approached us about expanding the mentorship program to include young adults transitioning from foster care to independent living. Ladies and gentlemen, I announced to the assembled group, I'm proud to report that Montgomery & Sons has not only survived the challenges of this past year, but has positioned itself for growth that honors our founder's vision while adapting to 21st century opportunities. The financial numbers were impressive. Revenue for the current fiscal year would exceed the previous year by 12%, while profit margins had actually improved due to more efficient project management and reduced administrative overhead. We'd added 6 new employees, increased benefits for existing staff, and established a scholarship fund for children of Montgomery & Sons workers pursuing post-secondary education. But the statistics that meant the most to me were the ones that wouldn't appear in any annual report. Maria Santos, one of our apprenticeship program graduates, was now studying civil engineering at the State University while working part-time for our surveying department. Kevin Park had discovered a passion for electrical work through our program and was enrolled in a technical college that would prepare him for his master electrician's license. Most importantly, we'd proven that a family business could maintain its values and community connections while adapting to changing circumstances and new leadership. The Montgomery name still carried weight in our region, but now it represented innovation and opportunity rather than just tradition and financial success. As the meeting broke up and our employees returned to their various projects, Grandpa Frank approached me with an expression that combined pride with something that might have been relief. "Your grandmother Helen would be so proud of you," he said quietly. "She always believed that the measure of success wasn't how much money you accumulated, but how many people's lives you improved along the way." Looking around the conference room where photos of completed projects covered the walls, I realized that I'd found something in the construction business that had been missing from my teaching career: the ability to create lasting change that would benefit multiple generations. The schools we built would educate children for decades. The homes we constructed would shelter families through good times and bad. The young people we trained would carry forward skills and values that would strengthen their communities long after I was gone. It had been a year of loss, transformation, and unexpected growth. But as I prepared to leave the office and head home to my new apartment closer to the Montgomery & Sons headquarters, I couldn't shake the feeling that our story was far from over. There were still challenges to face, relationships to rebuild, and dreams to pursue that would test everything I'd learned about leadership, family, and the difference between inheriting a legacy and earning one. 2 years after that devastating Thanksgiving dinner, I stood in the same dining room where my world had changed forever, but everything about the scene was different. The mahogany table was still there, still covered with Grandmother Helen's china, but the faces gathered around it reflected transformation that went far deeper than the surface. Mom was laughing at something Grandpa Frank had said about his attempts to master video calling technology, her face showing the kind of genuine warmth I hadn't seen since childhood. Dad was teaching my 8-year-old nephew Tommy how to properly carve turkey, his patience and gentle guidance revealing a grandfather I'd never known existed. And at the far end of the table, wearing a simple blue dress and no jewelry except her wedding ring, sat Brooke. My sister had been released from prison 4 months earlier after serving 26 months of her 3-year sentence, her early release contingent upon completion of a financial responsibility program and 200 hours of community service. The woman who returned to our family was fundamentally different from the one who'd been led away in handcuffs 2 years earlier. Prison had stripped away the artificial layers of status and appearance that had defined Brooke's identity for so long. Without designer clothes, expensive makeup, and the social currency of wealth, she'd been forced to confront the person underneath all the pretense. The process had been painful but ultimately healing in ways that expensive therapy and family interventions had never achieved. "I want to tell you all something," Brooke said as we finished our meal, her voice carrying the quiet strength of someone who'd learned to speak truth instead of performance. "I've spent the past 2 years thinking about this day, imagining what I'd say when I had the chance to sit at this table again. I rehearsed apologies, explanations, justifications for the choices I made." She paused, looking around at each of our faces with an expression that held no trace of the calculating manipulation I remembered from before. "But what I really want to say is thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me, for maintaining relationships that I had no right to expect, and for teaching me that family love isn't something you earn through achievement or lose through failure." During her incarceration, Brooke had participated in a vocational training program that taught her bookkeeping and office management skills. More importantly, she'd worked as a literacy tutor for other inmates, discovering a passion for education that had been buried under years of pursuing status and financial success. "I'll never be able to undo the damage I caused," she continued, "to the clients whose money I stole, to Brandon and his reputation, to our family business and everyone who depends on it. But I can spend the rest of my life trying to make amends through actions rather than words." Her community service was being completed at the Hartford Literacy Center, where she taught basic reading and math skills to adults who'd never had the educational opportunities most people take for granted. The work paid nothing and offered no social prestige, but Brooke approached it with an enthusiasm and dedication that surprised everyone who knew her previous priorities. "There's a woman named Carmen who comes to my Tuesday evening class," Brooke said, her eyes lighting up with genuine pride. "She's 34 years old and never learned to read because she had to work to support her siblings after their parents died. Last week, she read her first complete book, a picture book about butterflies that she bought to share with her daughter." The transformation in Brooke's values was evident in every aspect of her new life. She lived in a modest 1-bedroom apartment near the Literacy Center, furnished with items from thrift stores and yard sales. Her wardrobe consisted of practical clothes, suitable for working with students rather than impressing social contacts. She drove a reliable used Honda that got excellent gas mileage and required minimal maintenance. But the most significant change was in her relationship with our family, particularly with me. The rivalry and resentment that had poisoned our interactions for decades had been replaced by something resembling genuine friendship. We talked regularly, sharing stories about our work, discussing books we'd read, and planning activities with Tommy that didn't revolve around spending money. "Alexia," Brooke said, turning toward me with an expression that mixed admiration with regret, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what I did to our family business. I spent years trying to diminish your accomplishments because they made me feel insecure about my own choices. I was wrong about teaching, wrong about what constitutes meaningful work, and wrong about what makes someone worthy of respect. The admission was both healing and humbling. For so long, I'd wanted acknowledgement that my career choice had value, that helping children learn and grow was as important as any corporate achievement. But receiving that validation now, after proving myself in the business world, made me realize that I'd never actually needed external approval to know my own worth. Montgomery & Sons had continued to thrive under my leadership, expanding beyond traditional construction into sustainable building practices and community development projects. We'd recently broken ground on Connecticut's first net-zero energy elementary school, a project that combined cutting-edge environmental technology with our commitment to educational excellence. The mentorship program I'd started had evolved into a comprehensive workforce development initiative supported by state funding and private grants. We now partnered with 3 community colleges and 2 universities, providing pathways for young adults to gain practical experience while earning formal credentials in construction management, environmental science, and renewable energy systems. "I've been thinking about something," I said, addressing the entire family but looking primarily at Brooke. "Montgomery & Sons has grown large enough that we need someone to manage our community outreach and educational partnerships. It's a position that requires someone who understands both business operations and the challenges facing adults who are trying to rebuild their lives through education." The offer had been months in the making, discussed extensively with Grandpa Frank and reluctantly accepted by my parents, who were still adjusting to the idea that Brooke might have something valuable to contribute despite her past mistakes. "I can't pay you what you used to earn," I continued, "and it would mean starting at the bottom of an organization you once expected to inherit. But it would give you a chance to use your education and experience in service of something larger than personal advancement." Brooke's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of gratitude rather than self-pity. "Are you sure? I mean, are you sure you want to trust me with something that important after everything I did to betray that trust?" "I'm sure," I replied, surprising myself with how confident I felt about the decision. "Not because I've forgotten what happened, but because I've seen how much you've changed. The woman sitting at this table isn't the same person who made those destructive choices 2 years ago." Grandpa Frank had remained quietly observant throughout this conversation, but now he cleared his throat in the way that meant he had something important to add. At 80 years old, he was still sharp mentally, but had begun showing signs of the physical frailty that comes with age. His hands shook slightly when he lifted his coffee cup, and he moved more slowly than the energetic man who'd once supervised construction sites in all kinds of weather. "I want to tell you girls something," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 8 decades of experience. "When I built this company, I thought legacy meant passing down assets, maintaining traditions, keeping the Montgomery name associated with success and respectability." He paused to take a sip of coffee, gathering his thoughts with the deliberate care of someone who understood that words, once spoken, could never be retrieved. "But watching both of you over these past 2 years has taught me that real legacy isn't about preserving the past. It's about adapting principles to meet new challenges, finding ways to serve your community that honor your values while addressing contemporary needs." His gaze moved from me to Brooke and back again, encompassing a lifetime of hopes, disappointments, and hard-earned wisdom. "Alexia, you've proven that the Montgomery name can represent innovation and social responsibility without sacrificing financial success. Brooke, you've shown that failure isn't permanent if you're willing to learn from mistakes and commit to making amends." The conversation that followed lasted well into the evening, covering topics that ranged from business strategy to personal relationships to the broader question of what it means to rebuild trust after it's been shattered. We talked about the challenges Brooke would face returning to professional life with a criminal record, the ongoing work of repairing relationships with clients and community members, and the long-term vision for Montgomery & Sons as both a business and a force for positive change. Tommy fell asleep on the living room couch during our discussion, and I found myself thinking about the world he'd inherit, the lessons he'd learned from watching our family navigate crisis and recovery. Would he understand that strength isn't about avoiding failure, but about responding to failure with integrity and determination? Would he see that worthiness comes from service rather than status, from character rather than achievement? As the evening wound down and family members began their various journeys home, I stood on the front porch watching Brooke walk to her modest Honda. She moved with purpose now, without the affected elegance she'd once cultivated or the defeated posture she'd carried immediately after her release from prison. This was someone who'd found her footing in the world, who understood her place and purpose in ways that had eluded her during years of pursuing external validation. "Thank you," she called back to me before getting into her car. "For the job offer, for this dinner, for believing that people can change when they do the hard work of changing themselves." 6 months later, Brooke had become one of the most effective advocates Montgomery & Sons had ever employed. Her combination of business education, personal experience with failure and recovery, and genuine passion for helping others created connections with community organizations that had never considered partnering with construction companies. She'd developed a program that hired recently incarcerated individuals for entry-level positions while providing support services that addressed housing, transportation, and financial management challenges. The initiative had been featured in 3 industry publications and was being studied by workforce development agencies across New England. More personally, Brooke had begun dating Marcus Chen, a social worker she'd met through the Literacy Center. Their relationship was built on shared commitment to service rather than mutual advancement, and watching them together reminded me of what healthy partnership could look like. My own romantic life had taken an unexpected turn when I'd reconnected with David Martinez, a high school classmate who'd returned to our town after completing his master's degree in environmental engineering. He understood both my commitment to the family business and my passion for education, bringing his own expertise in sustainable construction practices to projects that benefited from technical innovation. We'd been engaged for 2 months, planning a simple ceremony that would reflect our shared values rather than attempting to impress anyone with elaborate displays of wealth. The guest list included students from our mentorship programs, employees from Montgomery & Sons, and family members who'd learned that love was more important than performance. As I reflected on the journey that had brought us all to this point, I realized that the question Brooke had posed 2 years earlier about worthiness and family names had been the wrong question entirely. We hadn't needed to prove ourselves worthy of the Montgomery legacy. We'd needed to evolve that legacy into something worthy of the community we served. The name itself was just a collection of letters on business cards and building signs. What gave it meaning was the commitment to integrity, excellence, and service that guided our daily choices. That commitment could be lived out through teaching elementary students or managing construction projects, through serving prison sentences or leading literacy programs, through building businesses or rebuilding broken relationships. Standing in the Montgomery & Sons conference room on a Monday morning in early spring, surrounded by project plans for schools, community centers, and affordable housing developments, I understood that my grandfather's greatest gift hadn't been the inheritance he'd promised or the business opportunities he'd created. His true legacy was the understanding that every person has the capacity to contribute something valuable to the world, that second chances are not just possible but necessary for families and communities to thrive, and that the worthiness of any name depends not on the achievements of previous generations, but on the choices made by the people carrying it forward. The little girl who'd felt excluded from family conversations about business success had grown into a woman who could lead those conversations while maintaining the values that made success meaningful. The sister who'd seemed destined for a life defined by destructive choices had found redemption through service to others who'd made similar mistakes. We'd all learned that the true test of family loyalty isn't supporting each other's successes, but helping each other recover from failures with dignity and purpose intact. As I prepared for another day of challenges and opportunities, I thought about the question I wanted to leave with anyone hearing this story. When faced with moments that reveal who we really are underneath our carefully constructed images, do we have the courage to choose growth over comfort, service over status, and truth over the stories we tell ourselves about who we think we should be? Your answer to that question matters more than your last name, your bank balance, or any external measure of success the world might offer. Because in the end, The legacy we leave isn't measured by what we inherited or what we accomplished, but by how many people's lives were better because we chose to become the best version of ourselves. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear about your own experiences with family challenges, second chances, or finding purpose in unexpected places. Have you ever had to rebuild trust after a major betrayal, or discover strengths you didn't know you possessed during difficult times? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story inspired you to think differently about forgiveness, family, or personal growth, consider liking this video and sharing it with others who might benefit from these lessons. Thank you for listening to my journey from that devastating Thanksgiving dinner to a life filled with purpose, healing, and hope. Remember that every ending can become a new beginning if we're willing to do the hard work of becoming who we're meant to be.